So interface is a word that has become recently very popular. And we live in a world that's governed by interfaces, especially when it comes to technology. Interface is defined as an entity that connects two distinct, separate entities. So whether you're talking about on a software level or hardware level, whether you're using a mobile phone or a keyboard or an internet protocol or a program or application, these are all interfaces. So communications is based on interfaces. In truth, even before technology, human beings are driven by interfaces, because just take an example, when your eye looks at something, so the eye sends the optical nerve sends a message to the brain processes it, and sends a message to the rest of you telling you, here's what you just saw and here's how you should react. These are all interfaces. So we don't live in a one-dimensional world, we live in a multi-dimensional world, and for it to function properly, you constantly need protocols and languages that are like translators. So just like you need a translator between two languages, whether it's English or Hebrew or French, the same is true in any type of interaction between human beings or interaction between any two forces. You need something that speaks both languages and does not annihilate one or the other. So as we speak right now, how many interfaces are functioning right now in your system, your being, your brain, your heart? As you hear my words and you process them, you're interfacing these ideas. If I communicate them well, you'll be able to absorb it. If I don't, the interface can be compromised. And the same is true in every area of life, especially relationships. You have two people, strangers, who want to have a relationship with each other, and yet they may have different agendas, and they have their individuality separates them. So how do they find a common ground? That's another interface. So really mastering and understanding and appreciating the idea of interfaces can really help us improve virtually every area of our lives. How we communicate with ourselves, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate with communities, how our heart and mind communicate, how our unconscious and conscious communicate. So I thought to address we're the first interface of all. It was clearly before computer programs, before mobile devices, before communication technology. So the question is, who was the first interface in history? And what has been written about it? Because often, and this is just a methodology, when you want to really appreciate an idea, it's always good to trace it to its roots. Because in its root, you really see it in its pristine form. Whereas over the years, it may get distorted, it may get corrupted, polluted, etc. So it was the first interface in history. And I submit here the first major interface was Sinai, this event at Sinai. And the reason being was, as I mentioned many times, before Sinai there was a schism between matter and energy. When Einstein writes the formula E equals mc squared, that was made possible due to Sinai, because Sinai created a bridge between matter and energy. Or in the words of the Medrash, that before Sinai there was a schism, a split between what was above and what was below. That which was above, the spiritual could not descend into the material, and the material could not ascend and elevate into the spiritual. Compartmentalized worlds, body and soul, matter and spirit, matter and energy, and so on. And at Sinai these two were bridged. So this is essentially the first interface, an interface that allows us to fuse these disparate and opposite worlds. But to drive the point home even further, when you read this week's chapter, and I'll read a verse at the end of the chapter, Pasha Nosei. This is usually the Pasha we read after Shavuos. There are times that it's read before, but most of the time it's afterwards. So at the end of the chapter is a very interesting verse. The verse states like this. Literally the end, the last verse in the chapter. The last verse in the chapter goes like this. By the way, is the longest chapter, I believe, in the entire Torah, consisting of 176 verses. So the last verse goes like this. And when Moses entered the tent of meeting, the Oyel Moed, which was the tent, the outer enclosure around the temple, around the sanctuary. This was the temporary sanctuary, the Mishkan, that they traveled with through the wilderness. So Moses approached or entered into the Ol Mod, l'daber itay, to speak with God. V'yishmes hakel, and he heard the voice speaking to him from above the kaperis, from above the cover of the ark, which was on top of the holy ark, between the two cherubs. That's where God spoke to him. Okay, it seems like a very simple verse, but it's not so simple at all. So Rashi, the commentary, says that this verse comes to reconcile two contradictory verses in the Torah. We know that the temple was built in order for God to interface between heaven and earth. The temple was made of physical matter, physical materials, and God said, also the Mikdash built for me a sanctuary, and I will rest among you. I'll soon explain this a little further, but I'm just talking about the technical part of it. And a temple was built, a sanctuary was built. And at that point, when the Jews were traveling through the wilderness, it was still temporary, because they had to travel. So it would be assembled, and disassembled, assembled, every time they would travel through the wilderness. Once they came to Israel, there were different points where this temple continued to rest, until finally King David established the place, the Temple Mount, and King Solomon actually built and dedicated the first temple on the Temple Mount, which today we visit. The Kotel Maravi is the outer wall, the western wall of the temple area. Then the temple was destroyed 410 years later. For 70 years it remained desolate. It was destroyed by the Babylonians and then rebuilt by Herod, and stood for 420 years until the Romans destroyed it as well. Also the same day, Tisha B'Av. And the only thing that remains is the western wall. The western wall is from the second temple. And that has always remained there forever. This site is considered holy till this very day, because Kedusha lo yazazim k'ema, holiness never leaves its space. It has eternal value, eternal power. And in this temple, it says that this is where God spoke to Moses. So Rashi brings like this. In one place, I'm quoting now Rashi. Rashi says the following. Two verses that disagree with one another. They contradict one another. And here comes the third verse in this chapter and reconciles between them. One verse says that God spoke to Moses from Ohel Moed. Ohel Moed, as I said, was the outer courtyard, which was outside of the Holy of Holies, where the ark, the holy ark. That's what it says in one verse. Another verse says, and I will speak to you from above the cover, from the Holy of Holies. This is a clear contradiction. Is he speaking to Moses on the outer courtyard or from above the ark, which is the Holy of Holies? So here comes the third verse here and says the following. That Moses approached the outer courtyard, and there he heard the voice that came from above the cover of the ark. So this third verse reconciles that the truth is that both are true. That the voice emerged from the ark and from the cover of the ark, but it traveled all the way to the outer courtyard, and that's where Moses heard it. That's what this third verse reconciles. So the obvious question is, why do you need three verses? Why not just say it clearly one time and that's all? You wouldn't have to have a contradiction. You have to have one verse says this, one verse says that, and the third verse comes to reconcile. So the answer to this is interface. What does interface mean? That whenever you want to connect two opposites, you need to have a third joint or third connection that has a piece of both of them. Like I mentioned before about a translator. A translator is someone that knows two languages. If someone speaks English, another person speaks Hebrew. The translator knows both English and Hebrew. In the context of a relationship with something that is beyond us, the question is, how do two forces come together without one annihilating the other? Let's for argument's sake, say you want to unite heaven and earth, the infinite and the finite, the mortal and the immortal. How is that possible? If we want to connect to the divine, God, which is the immortal, how can we connect without and remain intact? Moses asked God to see his face. And God said, no man can see my face and live. And we know this also to be true. When anyone has a spiritual experience, it can be quite dangerous. You have the story of Nadav, the two sons of Aaron. They rushed into the sanctuary the first day when it was erected and dedicated, after its dedication. And they got burned out. They literally burned up from the ecstasy. You have the story of the 4 great sages that went into the Pardes, the orchard. 3 of them did not come out intact. One went mad, one died, one became an apostate. Only Rabbi Akiva entered. So when you have, let's say, lahavdils, you can say, people who burned out through OD'd, like Jimi Hendrix, or Jim Morrison, or Janis Joplin, and others who may have not died, but basically burned their brains out, you find usually people who had a lot of energy, and were going higher and higher, and they could not return. They could not contain it. And this is possible if someone sometimes can be a very spiritual person, they can't ground it. So there's a big challenge when a person, you can get easily burned up by the intensity of any powerful force. And that's why great care has to be taken before one enters into a very deep spiritual experience. Even at the time of at Sinai, it says, as the Jews heard the 10 commandments, each commandment they heard, it says, Parcha neshmosam, akol dibur v'dibur, every utterance, their souls would expire out of the deep spiritual connection they had, and they needed to be revived again and again. So, when you're talking about a connection between ourselves and a higher entity, how can one connect that without destroying one or the other? And this is a question that thinkers and philosophers have had from the beginning of time. How high can man reach? So some argue, being mortals and being limited human beings, we could only go that high. Transcendence is very limited. Others, especially in Far Eastern disciplines, will say, you can go very high, but you have to give up something. You have to give up the illusion of the material world. You have to enter into the light, into the higher unity. To function in the marketplace of this material world, with all its corruption and greed, and so on, is a contradiction to having a spiritual life. There are those that argue that. Others, for example, Calvinism or the Protestant work ethic, argues, enter into the world, immerse, and try to be a virtuous person in your work. So the question is, can we actually unite spirituality and our material lives without one annihilating the other? The same question as I mentioned before about relationships. 2 people who are, let's say, strong personalities. How can they really come together and join as one, with them remaining intact, their individuality intact, and at the same time have love? Most people feel you have to surrender something, you have to compromise. You may get something better in return, but a relationship, some people feel, is all about compromise. Is it possible for 2 entities to actually remain intact and whole without compromise, and at the same time also connect? That seems much more complicated. It's easier to understand that 2 entities come together, but one compromises or is weaker and so on. So, in that context, this verse is actually quite powerful. That's why you need to have 2 verses. And then comes the third one. The first verse says, the voice of God comes from the Holy of Holies. You can't really hear the voice of God outside of the Holy of Holies. That's what it appears. In other words, it's speaking on behalf of the divine. The divine speaks from the Holy of Holies. And for you to appreciate it, you have to sublimate yourself. A second verse comes and says, no, but the divine has to speak to us. We live in the Holy of Holies. We're not even allowed to enter there. So the divine voice comes out of the outer chamber, from the courtyard. And you need to have these two verses, each one representing the strong identity of its particular entity. One expressing the divine from the Holy of Holies, the other one speaking in the outer courtyard. And then comes the third verse, and makes shalom, creates peace, and says, both are true. These 2 can meet. And this is the ultimate interface. It meets because the voice does originate from the Holy of Holies, but it travels into our realm. And that's where Moses stood and was able to bridge the 2 worlds. So you have the concept in Hebrew of shalom. You heard the word shalom, right? Shalom means peace, shalom. But in Hebrew, the word peace is more than just absence of war. Shalom also means complete, fulfilled. Shalom is complete. It's more than the absence of war. Shalom is an entity of its own. We can call it harmony within diversity. So here's the interesting paradox. Beauty is only possible when you have more than one entity. A beautiful color like blue or red, as beautiful as they are, you can't really call it beautiful. It's just a nice color. Musical notes, same thing. One note, as eloquent as it may be, is one note. You play it too many times, it becomes monotonous. What is something of beauty? Something of beauty means you take different colors, many colors, hues and shades. You combine them in the right fashion, create a symmetry, and that is called beauty. So beauty is really harmony within diversity. But here's the paradox. Diversity also has the potential of chaos. As soon as you bring more than one entity together, they can also disagree. They can contradict. So that's hence the word shalom. Shalom is not whether everybody's a clone, where we have different opinions, and yet we're able to find peace because we have a certain commonality that transcends our differences and connects us all. So it may sound like a paradox, but you know something? Everything healthy in the world functions this way. Look at your own body. From my flesh I behold God, it says. Look at your body. What is your body? It is one organism with millions and millions of different systems, trillions of cells, 75 trillion cells, many, many systems, organs and limbs, that if they were all separate, you would never imagine that they could all come together, and they function as one whole unit, with like an invisible synergetic voice telling them all to coordinate efforts. And that's exactly what they do, almost a miraculous way. The same as the large universe is like an organism. Look at nature, the ecosystem. Without human beings intervening is a perfect balance. Everything is not more than necessary, not less than necessary. And it all balances out. And when you look at it, it's exactly that, harmony within diversity. But harmony within the diversity, which is the ultimate interface, requires first there be unique entities, each one emerging as an individual, independent state of being. Then they come together in this unified fashion. So unity is not about everyone becoming the same. Unity is about seeing the harmony within the diversity. The same is with human beings. Two people can be very distinct individuals, very independent, very individual, each one with their own personalities. No two people think alike, no two people look alike, and yet they can find a common ground which does not only does not compromise one another, but they complement one another. Like in the human body, it's not compromise. When, for example, you put a piece of food in your mouth, and instead of it going into the windpipe, God forbid, it goes into the food pipe, and the windpipe closes, that moment the windpipe's closing is actually what's necessary. It's not being compromised. It's the body learning to function that every part of the body opens and closes when it needs to open and close. And it works in this, as I said, symmetrical fashion. So each one has its time, each one has its place, each one has its role. The same thing in a musical symphony, musical composition. You have many musical notes. As you play them, when you're playing one, you're not playing another. But then you need the next one. So you have both fierce individuality, but also fierce unity. This is the perfect example of having everyone is intact, but there's some interface that's connecting them all. And here in this week's chapter, the end of the chapter spells it out very clearly. If it's a divine voice, how could it be human? And if it's a human voice, how could it be divine? So you have one verse that represents the divine, the divine in its purest form, the Holy of Holies. There's one verse that represents the divine voice as it speaks to us on our terms. And then there's one that reconciles and says it's both. So the good example for this would be, maybe this is also the ultimate interface, is when a teacher begins teaching a student. So if you're the teacher and you have many brilliant concepts and ideas, So, before you begin teaching a student, you have to conceal them all and begin teaching. Let's take an example. Letters add up to words. Words add up to concepts. Actually, this morning, this is one of the things I taught, chapter 23 in Ayin Beis. So letters add up to words, words add up to concepts. Now, when you look at when the teacher who knows, let's say, take the word Baruch. Baruch in Hebrew is made up of 4 letters. Beis, Reish, Vav, Chav. It means blessing. Which means it includes an entire volume about blessing. Blessing someone with life, with health. On a spiritual level, Baruch is drawing down energy from its source, from Keser, through Chachma. There's all kinds of meanings in the word Baruch. Then, especially if you put the word Baruch together with an entire sentence, like Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu, then it adds even more meaning to it. So those who are educated, and not to be necessarily a great scholar, but even if you are a great scholar, the word, the Beis, the Reish, the Vav and Chav, as they come together in this word Baruch, take on a whole new dimension of meaning that you can no way that you could teach this to a new child, to a new student. So now you have a 5-year-old coming to school. And you're the teacher who knows all the deep meanings in this word Baruch. How do you begin teaching this to a child who doesn't even know how to read yet? The first thing you do is you show them the word Baruch inside of a book. And you say, you see this word Baruch is made of 4 letters. Let's look at the first letter, the Beis. Like a B. And let's pronounce it. Say Beis. Write down Beis. And you educate the child in this letter. The child has no clue that this letter is coming from a word that has volumes and volumes of teachings on it. So it's the same letter that the teacher or any brilliant scholar will also use when they use the word Baruch. But that same letter, because it's separate from the rest of the word, and the concept and the idea that is concealed within the letter, the student is able to begin to study in a very small scale, like a spoon-fed, what is a Beis? And then he teaches the child a Reish, and then a Vav, a Chav, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then you start teaching them after a while, this doesn't happen overnight, next year maybe, that these letters can combine to be a word, and this word has a meaning. In the beginning, the child only knows the simple meaning. But as the years roll on, this child learns how to read, learns how to understand. The words are parts of sentences, that are parts of paragraphs, that are parts of books. And this student, slowly, as their containers expand, as his or her containers expand, is capable of appreciating and understanding not just what the teacher, even beyond the teacher. But it all began because it was spoon-fed. There was a very narrow ray of transmission that allowed the student to grow in his own end. If the flow would have been too quickly, if you were to try to teach the child all the meanings in the word Baruch and blessing without them learning the ABC, Aleph Beis, you would overwhelm the child. The child would never learn anything. This is a perfect example of how an interface, a healthy interface, works. If you're not communicating with someone effectively, someone you love, it means there's something wrong with your interface. You're either going too fast or you're going too slow. Maybe you're not measuring properly, sensitively, with empathy, you're the recipient. And you could also kill someone with love. Just like you need gas, you need brakes. Just like the flow, you have to know when to withhold. And the art of true communication is not just saying what's right, it's knowing how to say it, when to say it, and the right measure, the right speed. You don't want to overwhelm a student, but you also don't want a student to become lazy. So you have to always go a little above their head, but not to the point where they get overwhelmed and discouraged. So the challenge is, how do you do it like raindrops? So we learned in the counting of the Omer, remember Chesed and Gvura. Gvura of Chesed. Raindrops, rain is Chesed, it's love. It's transmission. It's a flow. But it has to come down as drops. If it comes down in buckets, it will flood and destroy the field. It's equally destructive as if there was no rain altogether. When it comes down in raindrops, means measured, seasoned. Then each drop is absorbed into the ground, and then more rain can come down. This is called the proper flow. You ask engineers and technicians who develop interfaces, they'll say that's the key thing. The key thing is to know not just how to create a bridge between, but how to close the doors, that only that amount goes through, or else you destroy the whole system. So it's like a checks and balances, where the flow is entering, but it's very measured and directed in the proper formula, the exact proper algorithm. So, in the context of this week's chapter, that's exactly what happens here. If the voice came out from the Holy of Holies, that's too intense. It's very good as a divine voice, but it's not something we can contain. We are unable to enter the Holy of Holies without getting burned. So you need to have the voice that comes out through the Oyel Mayed, which is through the courtyard, through the outer courtyard. But that in turn is not as pure and divine as the one that comes out from the Holy of Holies. So each verse represents, as I said, its particular function. Then comes the interface verse, this third verse in this week's chapter, that says both are there necessary. That we have to have an element of the Holy of Holies, and you have to have an element from the outside, and then there's that third voice that mediates and reconciles between the two. And this is true in every interaction. When a healthy interaction is happening between two people, there are three things always taking place. There's one person's voice, the other person's voice, and a third voice that's deeper and more transcendent that can reconcile between the two of them. Find a way to bridge the two. Now we may not notice these three, but in any healthy, let's say, mediation or any healthy counseling, and I deal with this very often, you'd sit with a couple who will have disagreements about things, sometimes very serious disagreements, and you listen. So what I'm looking for is to hear how each voice speaks, to hear what they really are saying, see how each of them hears the other. Usually they don't, or else they wouldn't be sitting for advice, getting advice. And then trying to find, if possible, that third elusive ingredient that can show them both that they can complement each other. But it's not so simple, because this isn't just about two opinions. There's issues of ego and pride and hurt and betrayal and all kinds of things. Once you build up resentment, it's not that simple just to sit down and say, okay, let's hear your voice, and now let's find the third. Obviously, it's best to nip these things in the bud. The earlier, the better, because once it starts growing, it becomes a monster. And once it becomes a monster, it's far more difficult to address. But essentially, the goal and the method is to really find that type of in-between place. Now, to do that, you really need bittul. You need a measure of humility and a modesty and ability to not take yourself so seriously and not take the situation so, because if you do that, you lock yourself into a position and there's no flexibility at all. So even if there's room for reconciliation, or there's room for more than reconciliation, for fusion, but imagine two musical notes get into a battle with each other, and they can't even hear each other any longer. So the externals become an obstacle. That even if they have how to complement each other, they don't communicate any longer. Like there's a breakdown. So the interface gets corrupted, and you now need to struggle and work far harder to try to find that place where they meet. So the first interface of all in history, I submit, was at Sinai. And it's captured in the end of this week's chapter, which we always read after Sinai, after Shavuos, that talks about the two worlds coming together. And if you really apply this to our lives, you'll find so many different ways, so many different formulas, which I'll address a little more at length now, in how to create these interfaces in our lives. So, when they stood at Sinai, it says that a few days before they came to Sinai, it says that they were arguing. The Jewish people, as Jews know how to do well, argue. And they argued and argued until they came, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, when they approached Mount Sinai. It was still 6 days before the Sinai revelation. So it says that they approached Sinai. It says, Vayichen Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. The Jewish people rested there across the mountain. And the word in Hebrew, Vayichon, is said in the singular. Vayichon, not Vayachnu. Even though there were millions of people there, or at least 1 million people. So it doesn't say Vayachnu, they rested, it says Vayichon, he rested, as if one person. So the Medrash and Rashi explain, because they were like one person and with one heart. So something happened at Sinai, a transcendent power, that they recognized, that even though they had differences, they suddenly realized the harmony between them. Unfortunately, often this harmony, the unity between people that have different opinions, sadly, sometimes only is recognizable when there's danger. I mean, we see tragically that Hitler and the Nazis, in the most bizarre and obscene way, united all Jews. They didn't care whether it was Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, affiliated, unaffiliated, Haredim, ultra right-wing, ultra left-wing, atheists, believers. It made no difference. A Jew was a Jew was a Jew. They had all their, as I said, obscene calculations of how they calculated these things. But they united everybody. The question is, can we unite with each other in love with more intensity and passion than they united us with hate? And if not, that is a sad, sad commentary. And yet we see the challenge of our times is that each of us lives in our own little world, and it's very easy to have divisiveness and even hatred and separation between us all. Wars are fought. So even though, in essence, as the Talmud says, we're all limbs of one large body, but we don't feel it. Because if we felt that there's no way that one part of a body could hurt another part, if we all knew that we all complemented each other, can you think of a healthy person hitting themselves? Or if the right hand doesn't like the left hand, and suddenly will start cutting it off, God forbid, or hurting it in any way. And if someone does that, that's considered a very sick person. But yet there's a concealment. We cannot see this integral unity. In truth, when you study quantum mechanics today, modern physics, we know that there's a subatomic level, there's a connection between everything. Subatomic particles sense each other and affect each other. As strange as it may sound, this is today common knowledge in the quantum mechanics. That there is some type of underlying unity. Some use string theory to explain it. Some see it like as one big field of energy. There's that, I mentioned this several times, that TED talk by, what was her name? The neuroscientist. I always forget her name. Anyway, she was a neuroscientist. She went into neuroscience because of her brother being schizophrenic. And then, as luck would have it, she suffered a stroke. And being trained in neuroscience, she recognized the stroke and recognized its impact on her. And it was her left brain that was affected. So she describes in this talk, you have to see this talk, it's fascinating. It's not a religious talk, but she says the left and right brain function very differently. The right brain is a uniter. It sees things in terms of a field of energy. The left brain is what distinguishes between one item and the next. She speaks actually about this. She says, so I was seeing literally how my left brain was shutting down. Now, in a healthy person, the left and right brain work together, so we don't really distinguish. But here, she was having a clear evidence of a right brain at work without the left brain functioning. So she said, I saw a toothpaste, I see the toothbrush, but I can't bring my hand to touch it because the right brain doesn't relate to items. It only relates to a field of energy. She literally said, what you see is a unity. Everything is connected. Everything is like one field of energy. Imagine, let's say, you were able to suddenly see an invisible quilt, an invisible blanket, an invisible quilt that all the objects in this room are sitting on. And then suddenly you can't see the quilt anymore, so all you see is the objects. Think of it like, I guess a good example may be, let's say water, waves of the ocean washing up upon a bunch of objects. So when it washes upon the objects, you can't really see the objects any longer. They're all part of the water. But then the water recedes, and the objects suddenly emerge again. So example would be that everything is in one field of energy, many objects, all riding on this one quilt, and the left brain is what distinguishes. Anyway, you could hear from her even more eloquently. She describes exactly what she experienced. And it was fascinating because it's very clear that one part of the brain does see a unified field of energy. And another part of the brain, and essentially chesed, the right side of the brain, sees love, like water, sees everything as one. And gvura, which separates, like fire, it separates objects. It's distinct. It's the attribute of severity, of judgment, of discernment. Gvura is separates. The left brain separates. So we need both to function in a world like ours. But the truth is, they're like two different voices, and then there's an interface. Now, most of us are consumed with left brain thinking. We relate to things as objects, as items. It requires a little more effort, and some people have natural transcendence that see the connection between things. But we live in a world that is scattered. We see things in as points, as dots. And then we work on trying to connect these dots. But in truth, life is one continuum. It's one flow. It's like, think of it like frames of a film, which is we see it frame by frame, but it's really one bigger story. So if you speak from the perspective of the divine, coming from the Holy of Holies, everything is a field of energy. So the upside is it's the reality of existence. The downside is it doesn't allow for the distinction between one item and the next. The voice that came out of Oyel Moed, out of the outer courtyard, the courtyard around the sanctuary, I mean, it wasn't really the outer courtyard. Oyel Moed is outside of the Holy of Holies. So that represents distinction. In the Holy of Holies, the only thing that you sense is the divine. In the spiritual realm, it would be like the Ein Sof, the divine light before the Tzimtzum. There's no concealment. As I mentioned, it's like the teacher who understands the concept, and you don't see a distinction between Beis, Reish, Vav, and Chaf in the letters. So when you have that constant, that intensity of energy, what's lacking is you can't really spoon feed that. You can't really teach it to a child or to a beginner. So the Tzimtzum is what conceals. Then comes the ray of light, the Kav, which is the voice that comes out through the Oyel Moed. And ultimately the Kav, which is that ray of light, the transmission of the teacher, the Beis that starts teaching letter by letter by letter, is connected to the concept the way it was before, but in a diminished form. And its objective is to bridge the two worlds. So in the spiritual realms, that's exactly the structure. You have an entity that's complete unity. If that were to radiate with full intensity, without any limitations, our independent existence could not have emerged. For it to emerge, you need to have some level of concealment, total concealment. But then, total concealment as well closes off the door. So you need some interface that connects these two forces. Think of it like the faucet or the filter, which is yet another interface between, let's say, a reservoir of water, pumping water through the water mains and pump pipes into your home. But then when you turn on the faucet, only a small flow, a trickle, enters into your home. If the faucet breaks, you have a flood. The key is to have a flow that is containable. And the same is true in how we communicate love and how we communicate with each other. Too fast or too much, the volume is too high or too great, that floods and overwhelms. If it's too small and too little, it doesn't really create the connection as well. So the truth is, what you need to have is both working together. So it's 3 different stages. 1 verse, the 2nd verse, and the 3rd verse that creates shalom, that reconciles and bridges the two. And as I said, this can be applied in many models. What's fascinating when you learn Ayin Beis, the discourse I'm describing, is that he speaks about it in a very conceptual level. But this concept can be applied, as I said, in many sciences and many schools of thought. And that's where it really can get exciting. Because imagine if you were able to take these ideas and apply it and create actually new technologies, or create new ways of communicating, or new mediation, then you suddenly see how the Torah that was given thousands of years ago didn't just bring justice and civilization to the world, it actually brought modalities and paradigms that can help us prepare for a better world, and prepare our lives and connect our lives in new ways and new forms and new formulas. So what you have in this discourse, and I just mentioned a little taste of it, in these chapters talking about the interface on this level, is how we create a connection between the infinite and the finite, between the mortal and the immortal. And on a personal level, I mentioned relationships, but this also applies within oneself. Communicating with yourself as well. Very often we go to extremes. You don't need to be bipolar to go to extremes. We all go to extremes. There are times of high inspiration, high octane moments, and then there are low octane moments. Which means there are times we feel very inspired, very motivated, and there are times that we feel completely the opposite. And it's hard sometimes to find balance. In the Haftarah of the first day of Shavuos, we read the vision of Yecheskel. And as I mentioned many times here, the concept of Rotzei v'Shuv, the vision he saw of energy running and returning. Rotzei and Shuv, yearning and returning. Or you can call it tension and resolution. So when people complain, I wish my life was more stable and didn't have these ups and downs. As I once reminded somebody who was hoping and praying for a total so-called, let's call it flat life, meaning there shouldn't be these extremes. So I pointed out to him, he happened to work in medicine, that when you look at a cardiogram and it looks flat, God forbid, that's not exactly what you want to see. Flat line. So it's true in mathematics, the shortest route from one point to the other is a straight line. But this is not mathematics. We're talking about in life. In life, the shortest point from one to the other, you don't want to have a straight line. That's death. What you want to have is a wave, an equal wave. You don't want to go too high, to peak too high and then deep valleys. You want to have a symmetrical flow. That's all the wave. Talk about waves and particles. Not particles, it's waves. That's what a cardiogram is about. The heartbeat, as is the breath, are reflective of the rhythm of life, which is a pulsating energy. And the Kabbalists, in the terms of Kabbalah and Chassidus, it's tension and resolution. It's expanding and contracting as the heart does. And that's how it pumps energy. If it expands too much, and it's not commensurate to each other, the expansion and the contraction, you can have a problem. Irregular heartbeats. If it goes too fast or too slow. And same thing with breath. Breath has a rhythm to it. At times when we're running or we're out of breath, so that may be necessary for that moment in order to rush, that moment the body works overtime or the heart beats faster, but that shouldn't be the way all the time. That's for that moment, it's compensating. But in a balanced rhythm, there's a certain flow. Now, if you think about it, that's why shouldn't psychologically, that is exactly the way it should mirror also psychologically. The life has its ebb and flow, has its ups and downs. There are times of inspiration, there are times when we integrate. There are times where we research, and there are times when we conclude, when we process, and we come to a conclusion. So everything has its rhythm. That's called the rhythm of life, the journey. So there too you need to have the interface between the two. You can have a moment of inspiration, a great inspiration, and be very motivated, and very often it doesn't have follow-up. Why doesn't it have follow-up? Because you haven't interfaced it properly. You allowed yourself to either become overconfident and just let the inspiration dissipate, whereas the key thing is, and a moment of inspiration is to take on resolutions that you can't get out of. Some way commit to something that forces the inspiration to have a follow-up. That's called interfacing the inspiration. Allowing it to extend into your life. Something happens, you get inspired, so you decide, I'm going to do something about it, and this is what I will do. And you commit with another person to it. That's an interface that works. Now, we could have inspiration that will suddenly say, I want to change the whole world. That's usually not going to happen. So it cannot go to any extreme. The extreme of either doing everything or doing nothing is usually what happens. The key is to have the balance and to realize that in the moment of inspiration it's critical right now to humbly accept to do something about it and then something will come out of it. So in our lives, the challenge is that when you're in any type of extreme situation, you feel really bad, or you're feeling really good, both of them have their role. If you see them not as isolated, sporadic moments, but as part of a flow, think of it like the heart. So it's one flow. So if you only looked at a cardiogram, one part of the cardiogram, you only see a peak. But when you look at the entire thing, you see it's a constant flow, and it's actually a very eloquent and beautiful flow and rhythm. The problem is, we're trained in this fast food society. We've been reprogrammed, rewired to think in isolated moments. We think like in staccato type of a plan, where everything is a bunch of little parts, instead of seeing a flow. We don't necessarily respect the process. You know, a seed is planted in the ground. You look at the seed, hey, what happened to it? You look closer, it starts rotting. So you think, oh, it's over with, it's dying. It's not dying. It's metamorphosizing. From a seed, it's becoming a sapling, and it will slowly sprout. And then one day it'll grow into a big tree. So if someone just looks at the moment, you only see that moment, and you can think it's death. A caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, the cocoon, and closes up. You could think it's all over. The caterpillar is enclosed now in darkness. But then one day it will open up, like the egg that cracks open and a chick emerges. Life is a process. Everything is on its way elsewhere. Nothing is static. The only thing that could be static is the human being's illusion, where we become couch potatoes, and we slow down or completely abort the process, and you don't see things through. In nature, everything is seen through. It gets dark at night, and then the dawn breaks in the morning. And when the day ends, the sun will set, only to rise again next morning. This is the laws of nature. The same thing is in the process of every regenerative process. The trees now are blooming in the summer. Then there comes the fall, their leaves will fall, and they will then go into hibernation for the winter. Now, if somebody only looked at the moment, the season, the winter, they say all the trees are dead. But we know the trees are in a process, and they know it too. And there will come the time when they will bloom again. Human beings are exactly the same way, except because we are too smart for our own good, we can actually impose upon ourselves death when we're really alive. Where we see ourselves as being in the moment, and right now I feel dead, or I feel there's no movement. But why are we different than the rest of the universe, which is on a flow going to another place? Everything. Like the Rebbe Rashab, the author of Ayin Beis, said to someone, life is a Ferris wheel. If you're on top, it will turn, and you will go down one day. And then, when you're down, you will go back up. It's a wheel that turns. Galgal HaChezeh. So appreciating life, therefore, is stepping back and not allowing yourself to get seduced by the moment and think this is it. Everything is part of a bigger story. Now that takes discipline, humility, and above all, being secure. So I submit that one of the reasons we do that is because we're insecure. So if something comes your way, you grab the opportunity and think, if I don't have it now, it's all going to be lost. We don't respect the process. As a result, many of the most important things in life are sometimes lost on us. Because love is a process. All things that are real are part of a process. It's superficial things or artificial things that are not part of a process. You know, the fact that we today can go into a grocery store 24/7 in New York City and buy any fruit, no matter what season, even though it's out of season, is not natural. And deludes us into thinking that everything is available at all the time. So I'm not taking away from the gift that we have. But you know, like that joke with the Italian and the French and the Jew are all told that they will be put to death, and they have one last wish before their death. What would they like to eat? So the Italian asks for a real fancy lasagna. They give it to him, and then then they hang him. Then comes the Frenchman, asks for filet mignon, and he gets that. They put him to death. And the Jew, they ask him, and he says, "Give me a moment, I want to think about it." And he asks for strawberries. He says, "Strawberries? It's out of season." So he says, "I can wait." You know, So the point is that it's healthy to know that there are things in season, there are things out of season. But we live in a world where we can today delude ourselves in thinking everything is available all the time, anywhere. So the gift of that we understand, but what it also does is desensitizes us from the flow of life. People tell me who live in Los Angeles that though they love the climate there, but there's something very plastic about it, because it's always, and no, with all due respect. Huh? Okay, I'm just telling you. Some people say that, and they say because it's plastic, because it creates the illusion that everything is always the same weather, climate. Whereas in New York, there's harsh winters, there's scalding summers, there's ups and downs, and so on and so forth. It's more natural to the rhythms of ups and downs of life. I'm not paskening here. I'm not ruling on the matter. Everybody can make their opinion. The point I'm just making mention of that. So there is something to be said about cycles and rhythms and so on. So in the context of interfaces, in the context of how we grow in life, understanding that is realizing that it's all part of one process, and that everything is leading somewhere else, and there are interfaces that connect one step to the next. And to try to force the rhythm, meaning try to force a situation where there's only highs or only and no lows, is simply unnatural and unhealthy. The key thing to remember, as I said, Ratzi V'shuv, that it's a cycle. I mentioned many times the Baal Shem Tov's, whose yahrzeit is on Shavuos, his 252nd yahrzeit with the Shavuos. So he gives a famous example called Schwindeltreppe. Schwindeltreppe in Yiddish means swindling staircase, a spiral staircase. But it's called swindle, like the swindling staircase. Why swindling? Because it swindles you into thinking that you're not reaching the destination. When you walk up a straight staircase, so there you see maybe many steps, but you see a destination. When you walk up a spiral staircase, every time you reach one point, you make a complete 360-degree turn. And at some point, you turn 180 degrees with your back to the destination. You don't even know you're climbing. To the point that when right before you reach the pinnacle, you have to turn completely around, and you can convince yourself that there's no destination, you're not reaching the height, you're just with your back to it. And this is the lesson he gives about seeing things through. That sometimes right before a breakthrough, that's when we give up. And that life is a process. So every time you knock on the door, it gets easier. Even though you may not always see the fruit of your labor, but never think that an effort didn't go anywhere. Many of us think we tried, and we were a failure. Not necessarily. The effort itself opened doors. Whether you got what you wanted is another story. Maybe you didn't need to get that. Maybe you need to get something else. But the point is, life is about a hidden choreography, and there's a mystery to it, and there's a rhythm to it. And though we all like to have quick results, plant the seed, I want the results immediately, it's not the way it really works. And if it worked, and the things we get immediately are worth its weight in gold, which means that which is born overnight dies overnight. That which takes time to build has enduring and lasting power. So in the world of interfaces, Ayin Beis is a central theme in so many different ways. And over time, hopefully I'll be able to make a list of all the different interfaces. I've already identified at least 30, 40 on so many different levels, and how that plays itself out in our own lives. So we'll talk about the interface between the unconscious and the conscious that I mentioned earlier. Here I wanted to discuss more the context of Shavuos, the bridge between matter and spirit, and between our own conflicting and separate forces. So of course there's the battle that we all have between our hearts and our minds. Moyach and Lev, where the mind is a reflective force and the heart is an impulsive one. And how often does it happen that your mind tells you one thing, your heart tells you something else? And you know who usually wins out, right? Can you guess? It's the heart that usually wins out. The emotions. So there are times that we even know that what we're about to do is wrong. And your mind tells it to you, and you still do it. You minimize it, you ignore it, or you can just call it a moment of insanity if you wish. On this week's chapter about the Seita, the Talmud says, "Ein adam ever aver elim kenichnus by ruach shtus." which means a person does not sin, does not transgress unless they have a moment of insanity, a moment of blindness. Because if you saw that this was fire, you'd never put your hand in it. How could you put your hand in it? Because you don't see it's fire, so you're blinded for the moment. The impulsive heart has the power to blind us and bias us and bribe us. And bias, Sheikhid Ya'avir, blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the tongue of the righteous. So if you need a battle going on, just look at the battle between the mind and the heart. But then we have the concept of Moyach Shalta Alev, which is self-control. Mind over matter. Lawrence Taylor, if I may quote him, the linebacker of the New York Giants, long ago retired, used to play quite injured, and they asked him, how does he do it? So he said, it's mind over matter. When you don't mind, it doesn't matter. I give him pretty good credit because he's usually not known as such a brainy guy, you know. But mind over matter really is the idea where the mind has the power to discipline and to channel the emotions. In other words, in a healthy situation, you want your emotions to tell you their reaction, but you don't want them controlling your life. You want to be able to look at something objectively before you get yourself into trouble, and then allow your emotions to come in full force. So think of the brain as being like the captain of the ship, and the ship itself is the emotions. Left on their own, emotions are impulsive and reckless even, and we'll react to what our emotions are impulsively to things, even if they're self-destructive. The mind, thank God, allows us to step back and reflect. Say, 1 second, before I put this in my mouth, maybe it's poisonous. It may look very sweet, but it may be very dangerous, etc., etc. So here you're two, in Ayin Beis talks at length about the interface between mind and heart. How do these two speak to each other? We know that the emotions can definitely bias the mind, but how does the mind communicate with emotions? You know, a heart that is in pain, or a heart that is in joy or in love, will not necessarily listen to rational ideas, because at that moment it has its needs, and it's very much driven by its subjective interests. And yet, they do have an interface that communicate with each other. We see it all the time. We see it all the time. We see situations where push comes to shove. You're not going to let yourself just be hurt. You will ultimately in some way protect yourself. Doesn't mean always, but it means that the mind does have the ability to speak to the heart. Sometimes we have to get burned several times before that happens. Like they say, when a man with money meets a man with experience, so the man with the experience ends up with the money, and the man with the money ends up with the experience. Now, if that happens to you too many times, maybe you should change businesses. In other words, initially, you will be taken advantage of by someone who's more experienced. But at some point, you learn to regulate yourself and not react emotionally to something, and that way you make more sober and more sane decisions. So there is an interface between mind and heart as well. So wherever you turn, you'll find different voices require some interface. So you could apply it this way. If something's not working in your life, what your real question has to be is, where's the interface in that area that can make this work, and why is it not working? Is the interface missing? Is it compromised? Do I not know how to find it? So it's already a way of reframing every issue or trouble or challenge we have by just simply asking that question. I'm not suggesting the answers will always be simple, but phrasing it the right way, the right question, as we said, half the cure of an illness is awareness. Or the question of a wise person, half an answer. When you reframe an issue or problem with the right question, you're already on your way to finding some solution. So the question has to be, when things aren't working, where is the imbalance? Where is the interface here? And why can't I not apply it? Sometimes the answer is because you don't even know how to interface these two forces. Sometimes you do, but the interface is not functioning properly. Sometimes you need a third opinion, an outside opinion, an objective opinion to help identify. So the point being is that life can be broken down to things that work have proper interfaces, and things that don't work have broken interfaces, or compromised ones, or limited ones. This is both in comprehending ideas, in dealing with emotions, in communicating with each other, in love and relationships, in working, in coexisting with co-workers and with others, and so on. Across the board, wherever you turn, you can find these applications. So to go back to this end of this verse, end of this chapter, the idea that you have the two entities, you have the Holy of Holies, the divine, you have the human, and then you have the bridge. And you have three verses. Because Shalom does not mean you have one entity, you have diversity, two, and then comes harmony, the third, that creates, that mediates, that finds the commonality. And that is, of course, the most beautiful part of the experience. When you can find that third party, that third ingredient, that shows you how both are necessary and both are indispensable and they both complement each other, that's when you really feel that you really feel at peace, because it creates an integration and a fusion. So we shall continue this theme in different classes, theme of interfaces, theme of integration. And as I said, we'll soon be sending out an email that's going to offer this weekly email 72, Club 72. That will be hopefully a very meaningful journey. I personally am very excited about the study and the teaching of this Ayin Beis. You can check it out. I have already, probably up on YouTube, we have probably 130 classes up there already, 130 chapters. Initially it may seem esoteric and overwhelming, but if you check out one, you may find it pretty interesting and relevant. I'm trying to explain these ideas in very palatable and practical terms, and I think that it really has the power to open our minds, expand our minds in very new ways. And it's always great, in this world we live in, with all that's going on, it's great to have a new challenge. Why not climb the Mount Everest of mysticism called Ayin Beis? So, I invite you all into this odyssey, into this journey, and hopefully we reach great heights. With that being said, I want to again dedicate the class to a good friend, Velvel and Sarah Farkash, birth of their boy. I think their child before that is 12 years old. Yeah, 12 years ago they had their last child. And I will also announce my good friend Philip Namelworth. He's right here. He's going to be giving his class tomorrow. I received the email, so I know that. Let's see if you can guess who's Philip. I'm looking at him right now. People on the camera cannot see. And we will be continuing these classes going now through the summer. If there's any changes, we notify you by email, announcements due to the different schedules. But hopefully we will be going week by week. And again, I invite you all to, if I can be of any service to you in any way of helping you in your spiritual journey or psychological journey, please don't hesitate to contact me or my office. And if you haven't left your email address, please do so. What else can I add? We have, I think, a few of the books beyond the letter of the law here. As well, the Omer counting is over, but refining our emotions is a year-long journey and process. And as always, it's a great honor to spend some time with kindred spirits, indispensable musical notes. And if we can show an example of our being here, of showing how we can complement each other by both bringing out the best and uniqueness of each other at the same time, how we all complement one another, I think that's a very good living example to a model that perhaps can be replicated and have a ripple effect on the entire universe. So with that, I bid you all a good evening, or those that are listening, good morning or good afternoon. That way we cover all the time zones and whenever anybody may be listening to this. And until next week, thank you very much.